Welcome to our third video to help students review for the PPR exam. This time we'll be discussing Competency 3, Planning Effective Lessons. Let's first read what the state of Texas would like teachers to know for this competency. Competency 3. The teacher understands procedures for designing effective and coherent instruction and assessment based on appropriate learning goals and objectives. As you can see, this lesson will be focusing on lesson planning and lesson design. One important curriculum design method that teachers can use is backwards planning. Backwards planning was developed by Wiggins and McTighe in 2005. It argues that first teachers must consider what are the overarching knowledge and skills that students need to know. In other words, what are the desired learning outcomes and results that students need to have to be successful in that current grade, the following grades, and in their lives. The next stage is for the teacher then to consider how could we break that information into manageable chunks and pieces, and also how can we evaluate whether students have learned that essential information. So what specific assessments will we provide throughout the year to make sure students understood the content? Finally, stage 3, then the teacher plans specific lessons based on how they can prepare students for those assessments, which will later prepare them for those overarching outcomes and results. While backwards planning allows the teacher to organize content throughout the entire year, a great way to conceptualize how to deliver individual lessons is through Moore's model of teaching. According to Moore's model of teaching, first teachers have to develop and select curriculum. Many times the curriculum comes actually from the state or district in which the teacher is teaching. Next, the teacher identifies specific topics or chunks of information that they are going to teach in the individual lesson. Then, the teacher plans instruction based on those specific knowledge and skills they want students to know. Later, the teacher then teaches the lesson through explicit instruction and through providing students with various practice opportunities to practice with the content. Next, the teacher evaluates students' learning through providing an assessment for students. After students take the assessment, the teacher then analyzes the outcomes, provides feedback to students, and shares the outcomes of the assessment to students. And then students themselves also self-reflect on their assessment, and they come up with goals for their future learning as well as criteria to determine if they've met those goals. Next, and last, the teacher will provide follow-up learning opportunities or differentiation. There are 3 types of differentiation. The first type could be remediation for students who struggled with the assessment and need additional practice. A second form of remediation could be language learning remediation, in which the teacher works with English language learners to help facilitate their academic language development. And the third type of follow-up activities could be for advanced students that need further challenging work. And this would be called enrichment or extension. And during these parts of the follow-up activities, advanced students receive activities that are more challenging and or above grade level to further extend their thinking and knowledge on the content area. We're going to discuss each of these concepts in more detail in the following slides. Let's begin our discussion of Moore's model of teaching. First, we're going to discuss Part 1, how to select curriculum. When teachers select curriculum, they go through the process of curriculum mapping. Curriculum mapping is when teachers and educators work collaboratively with campus, district, or even state officials to help decide how to organize the sequence in which grade level content is taught. There are 3 major elements of this process. The first part is when educators decide what specific information or content will students need to know. Next, the educator considers what skills will students need to have to be able to understand that content and apply that content in their lives. Third, educators consider how will students be assessed throughout the year. How will they have to demonstrate their knowledge and skills? Fortunately, most districts provide curriculum maps or scope and sequences, which provide specific information and guidelines on the order in which content should be taught for each grade level. I provided an example of one from Houston ISD below. Now we're going to discuss the second part of Moore's model of teaching, identifying specific topics. When identifying specific topics to teach students, the teacher must reflect on what are the long-term learning goals or enduring understandings that students must have related to the content to be successful in their future lives. Specifically, what information or knowledge will students have to know, and what specific skills or abilities will students have to be able to do to demonstrate their knowledge. An example of this could be the topic of author's purpose in reading, language arts instruction. So while the knowledge that students might need to know is how to identify the author's purpose, for example, how to identify when the author's purpose is to persuade others, but students might also need to know what the following skills, how to write a persuasive essay with evidence and logic to support their conclusion. This would be an important skill for students to know, because not only are they understanding how to identify someone else's purpose for writing, but they can actually apply the concept in their own lives in the real world. When considering specific long-term learning goals, you should also devise essential questions that you will ask students to reflect on these essential concepts. Some of these questions could be, for example, open-ended questions that are thought-provoking, that require students to connect their prior knowledge and their prior experiences to the current topic. Questions that get students engaged, that pique their interest and evoke dialogue and debate among students. And also questions that help guide students and lead students to the essential understandings of the content. After you've identified specific topics you're going to teach, now it's time to plan instruction. When you are planning instruction, you should follow the following steps. Step 1, identify learning objectives. So, learning objectives have two types: content learning objectives and language learning objectives. First, we're going to discuss content learning objectives. Content learning objectives are the specific information and skills that students have to know about a specific content area, like math, reading, science, social studies, foreign language, music, art, etc. The content learning objectives come from the state. In Texas, we call them the TEKS, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And there are specific content objectives for each grade level and each content area. The content objective includes not only what knowledge students have to know, but also how they're going to apply their knowledge, or what skills or abilities they must possess to utilize that knowledge. When developing your content learning objectives, make sure to reference the district's scope and sequence or curriculum map, which will tell you the order in which you will teach specific topics. Also, when you write your content learning objectives, make sure you write them based on a task performance, like in the format students will be able to or students will. Also, think about the order in which you teach content objectives. In Texas, there are two types of content objectives or TEKS. There are readiness TEKS, or readiness standards, and there are supporting standards. Readiness standards, like the name implies, should be taught with more emphasis and should be taught first. While both readiness and supporting standards should be taught, teachers should focus on readiness standards and ensure that all students have those to be ready for the next grade. Teachers should not only identify the content learning objectives, but teachers should provide the objective for students, either by posting it on the board, posting it on the poster, or saying it out loud to students. When teachers provide learning objectives to students, the following characteristics should be upheld. First of all, the objective should be specific and measurable. So you should directly explain how you expect students to utilize the material and the concepts, what it will exactly look like. An example of this would be in the following content objective. Students will be able to write a 5-paragraph essay using transition words to connect paragraphs. In that content learning objective, it was very specific about what we were talking about. What type of essay? 5-paragraph essay. What type of introductory words? Transition words. Furthermore, it was very measurable. Whether or not a student achieved this or accomplished this content objective was whether or not they could write a 5-paragraph essay linking each paragraph with transition words. A bad example of a vague objective that could not be measurable would be the following. Students will understand essay writing. First of all, it is not very specific. What kind of essay writing? What does understand mean? Furthermore, how is it measurable? How are we going to determine whether or not a student understood the concept? Moreover, objectives should also be attainable for students. So students need to be able to have the prerequisite background knowledge to successfully learn that new content. They need to have the prior learning from either their home lives or from earlier grade levels to be successful in learning the content. If they don't have that foundational knowledge, you will need to revise your content objective to make it more appropriate to students' ability levels. Furthermore, objectives need to be age appropriate, and the types of learning activities further also need to be age appropriate based on how students learn. Please refer back to Competency 1, in which we discussed Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Another thing to consider is that objectives should be attainable and that realistically the teacher is going to model the information to students and provide several practice opportunities. But after that, students are going to be required to demonstrate their knowledge on their own independently. So do not create content objectives that after some modeling and some practice, students would still not be able to do on their own. A second part of learning objectives involve language objectives. So language objectives are useful for all students, but they're particularly beneficial in classrooms that have English language learners. Language objectives say and focus on what specific language skills, regardless of the content area, will students need to know to be successful. So even if you're not teaching a language arts class, let's say you're teaching a math class or a science class, there are still language elements that students will have to use in that class to be successful. Students will have to know vocabulary terms that are necessary for that content area, like product, or sum or hypothesis. Students will have to know how to read text and comprehend because there'll be word problems or lab experiments that students have to complete. And students will have to also be able to write, to be able to express their thinking in textual form through writing. So, language objectives specifically discuss also not only what vocabulary students will need to know, but also how students will use language. So, what verb tenses, so the present tense, the past tense, the future tense, will students use during the lesson to speak about the content and to write about the content. Also, what kind of verb tense will they see in the text they read as part of learning that lesson? Next, students will also learn about the language domains, listening, speaking, reading, and writing that students will be required to use during the lesson. And remember, even in, let's say, fine arts, let's say in a music classroom, students will still need to use all 4 language domains. They're going to have to be able to listen and comprehend what the teacher is instructing. They'll have to speak and answer questions or voice their rationale for how they're going to play the instrument or how they came to the solution or how they wrote the piece of music. They're going to have to read text about music and perhaps read instructions about how to use their instrument or read about composers. And they'll also have to write in some way. They might have to write a reflective essay on how they performed, or they might have to write down their thinking process or even their practice log. So all of these elements, these 4 domains of language, are used in should be used in each lesson. And as such, you should make those your language objectives. So an example of a language objective might be, let's go back to the music lesson, let's say a high school band class. An objective might be students will be able to identify important vocabulary related to the mechanics of music. Students will also have to be able to listen, speak, read, and write about the composer which they're performing. Another thing to note, and this is kind of a duplicate of the earlier slide, but there is one thing to note is that when we get our content objectives, remember we got them from the TEKS. However, when we get our language objectives, how students are going to use language in whatever content area you're teaching, we get those from the ELPS, the English Language Proficiency Standard. And they're going to be very broad. They're not going to be specific to each subject area. They're going to be broad, like students will have to be able to write a complete sentence, or students will understand informal and academic language. They're going to be broad, but you can tailor them based on to your content area. After you've determined the learning objectives, or the content objectives and language objectives that you want students to learn in the lesson, you are going to create the assessment that you will use to determine if students understood the content. Once again, this goes back to backwards planning. We want to keep the end goal in mind and work backwards. So our end goal is that students are successful on that assessment and that they're able to demonstrate their learning. And from there, we're going to work backwards to create individual lessons. So step 2 involves determining the assessment. When you create an assessment, think of the following questions. How will I determine if my students' prior knowledge from the previous year's instruction, from their past teachers, is sufficient for them to understand this new grade level's content that's more difficult? Second, How will I evaluate students on the information, and how will students be evaluated at the end of the year by the state and district? Third, what information will I need to ensure that students understand, and what skills will students have to know and be able to use so that they're successful in their future lives and careers? Then you're ready to make the assessment. The first type of assessment you will create for your lesson is a diagnostic assessment. A diagnostic assessment or tool is like a pretest. This is your way to assess whether students have the fundamental knowledge or the foundational skills that they should have received in the previous years or even earlier years' instruction. However, if students have not received those foundational skills, you will have to modify your lesson to make sure that you're reteaching those fundamental skills. So the good thing about diagnostic assessments is not only does it identify for you which students might need additional teacher and peer support during the lesson because they might not have fully developed those foundational skills, but also you could consider what remedial skills or what skills from earlier grade levels would you might need to instruct to all students because students are lacking those foundational skills before you address the more difficult and complex skills that you're going to teach at the current grade level. Sometimes people use another version of the final assessment from the year before to determine students' foundational level. So they use that as a diagnostic assessment. After you have created or adopted a diagnostic tool to evaluate students' foundational knowledge from the year before, you will create your own summative assessments for each specific content topic that you discuss throughout the year. So summative assessments are ways to sum up students' learning, or they're almost like assessments that have several subjects or content topics into one section. So you have seen these before in your student career. These could be chapter tests, midterms, papers, major assignments, group projects, presentations. And these summative assessments that you create throughout the year eventually prepare students to be ready for the end-all summative assessment, which is created by the state or by the district, the end-of-year exams. After the teacher has determined what will be the summative assessment for each specific content topic, the teacher then thinks about how will I plan instructional activities to prepare my students to be successful for that assessment. One way that teachers will do this is to break the whole topic, let's say multiplication, into manageable chunks or sections of information. So many times teachers, depending on the length of the class, might teach a new topic into 2 or 3 chunks. Maybe, what is multiplication? How does multiplication relate to addition? What are the elements of a multiplication equation? How to multiply one digit by one digit numbers using visual representations, etc. So each of those are chunks of information. For each individual chunk or piece of information that the teacher will teach the students, this teacher should provide several practice opportunities and also several different representations of that information. So students should not be doing the same activity, the same type of problem, or the same type of text throughout the lesson. They should be exposed to different types of questions, different phrases of questions, different forms of activities, maybe short answer, multiple choice, group projects, oral presentation, performance measure, etc. So an example might be, let's say you're teaching the topic of main idea in reading. So on the first day, students might read a passage and they'll work with the teacher to determine the main idea, and they'll write the main idea of that passage in their own words. The second day, students are going to practice with the content in a different way. They might write their own story and then have their partner pick the main idea. The third day, students will practice in a whole another way, a different representation of their learning. Maybe they might read an entire story, not just a passage, maybe an entire book, and then they might answer a question related to what was the main idea of that book, and that question is written in a multiple choice format. So as you can see, students were presented with several different activities, and the types of activities they were doing were in different formats. So whatever way students are asked to do it in the real world or on future assessments, they'll be ready to do that because they've practiced with the content in various ways, not just one way. When you're planning your instructional activities, you need to also find instructional resources to support students. So, some of those resources might be your state-adopted textbooks. One thing to remember, though, is you can't just teach solely from the textbook because most textbooks are actually developed by publishers for various states. And so textbooks only have to have a minimum of about, let's say, 60% of the TEKS covered. So even though it's supposedly a textbook written for, let's say, Texas, some content will not be taught in enough detail for your students to be successful to understand all of the objectives that the state wants students to learn, all of the TEKS. Some other types of instructional resources could be workbooks. Sometimes there are many workbooks that are co-opted from the actual textbook makers. So many times textbook companies will provide workbooks that go along with their textbook. You also need to think of what technology you'll apply to help reinforce the lesson and what ways students can utilize technology to practice the content, what kind of games, what kind of websites, what kind of instructional videos they could use. You'll also need to think about what kind of differentiated materials you'll need to provide to students to meet them at their current grade or reading level. So some students who might be, let's say, in 5th grade might unfortunately be reading at a 2nd grade reading level. So you want to make sure you have differentiated materials to meet students at their reading levels or also their language levels. So you might provide simplified texts that are more straight to the point and more direct in their phrasing using simple sentences and have less unusual vocabulary terms for your English language learners. Or you might provide advanced materials above grade level for your advanced students that are your gifted and talented students. I didn't talk about this in the last slide, but another form of instructional resources or materials could be also hands-on learning materials. So this could be manipulatives to teach math like counters or base 10 blocks. It could be lab equipment to teach science. It could be the actual instruments and music instruction. It could be the animal technology for animal science and agricultural science. Now we're going to shift to the next step, which is once you've determined the content and you've determined the order in which you're going to teach the content, you now want to create individual formative assessments for each chunk of learning. So every time you teach a new piece of information, let's say you teach science, you teach the parts of the water cycle. And then you want to later teach another chunk about how the water cycle affects humans in your community, or another chunk of information about particular elements of weather related to the water cycle. Each of those are three different chunks or pieces of information or sections of information that you want to explain one at a time. So once you teach each of those topics, you're going to have to think of a formative assessment to determine if students understood each specific chunk of information. A formative assessment are often primarily informal assessments that the teacher uses to structure their instruction. So based on how students do on their formative assessment, the teacher might determine, okay, students did pretty well in the formative assessment, so I can move on to the next chunk of information. So they did pretty well in understanding the 4 parts of the water cycle. Now I'm ready to explain how the water cycle affects humans. However, if students struggled in that formative assessment, the teacher might stop and think, I need to either reteach to the whole class, or I need to provide an enrichment activity to students who did well on the formative assessment and reteach in small groups and remediate for those students who are struggling, those few students that are still not getting it. We're not ready to move on just yet because several people are still struggling to understand that specific chunk of information. So some examples of formative assessments could be exit tickets, where students write down something they learned, or an important fact, or they summarize the lesson, the key elements of the lesson, like they write the main idea of what they learned. Another form of formative assessments could be just the teacher asking questions. It could be the students turning and talking to each other to share what they learned. It could be a partner teach, or it could be a Kahoot or a quiz, or some form of paper quiz where the teacher gets immediate information and data on how students performed on the lesson. Once again, based on the data, the test results or quiz results, the teacher will determine whether or not they're ready to move on to the next chunk of information. And so each day you should have a formative assessment. You don't have to necessarily put it in the grade book, but you need to have at least, and you can have more than one formative assessment a day. But whenever you're teaching a new chunk of information, you should have an assessment at the end to see whether or not students really got what you were trying to teach them, whether they really obtained those content, knowledge, and skills that you were looking to embark and provide to them. The next stage will be you determining the difficulty level of your lesson. Another term that we use to describe difficulty is rigor. At the beginning of your lesson, you want to start at an easier rigor level or difficulty level. However, you want to quickly build up and challenge students and increase the difficulty level or rigor level. Also, you want to be sure that you're looking at how students will be assessed in your summative assessments that you created, and also the district and state assessments that you will be administering to students. You want to make sure that students are regularly practicing at the same difficulty level that they are going to see on those assessments, so that they'll be more likely to be successful. There are 2 different ways to conceptualize rigor: Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge. And we're going to talk about both of them. Bloom's taxonomy provides a hierarchy or a ranking of thinking skills from basic to more complex. There are lower order or basic thinking skills, which are remembering and understanding. And then the top 4 skills, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, are higher order thinking skills or critical thinking skills. So the most basic way, or the most basic level of difficulty, would be to have a student's remembering facts or recall. So Who was the president of the United States after the American Revolution? Or who was the first president? The second level of Bloom's taxonomy, which is also still a lower level of thinking, would be describing or summarizing the knowledge that they've learned. So basically retelling information, two separate parts of information together that they have learned from their teacher. So an example might be describe the United States at the beginning of its inception. It's the beginning of its country. What states were there? How many people lived there, etc. This is the student is not really having to think for themselves, but they are having to locate information in their text or from their notes or what they've heard before and restate them in their own words. So it's slightly more advanced than just remembering one fact. Those were lower level skills. The higher order skills, or the advanced critical thinking skills, really make the student think for themselves. So the student's not just regurgitating information they've heard or repeating or finding information given textual sources, but now they're having to actually connect their learning to their previous learning experiences and also to make their own judgments. So the first higher order thinking skill is applying. When students apply their concepts, they connect it to a new situation. So going back to that theme of the American Revolution, you might say to your students, how does the American Revolution relate to the French Revolution? Or how could we connect the American Revolution to modern revolutions occurring in the world today? The next stage is analyzing. Analyzing is also a higher order thinking skill, and it requires students to organize information through comparing and contrasting. So, what were the differences and similarities between the American Revolution and the Civil War? Evaluating is the next stage. So in the evaluating stage, which is also a higher order thinking stage, students have to justify their opinion and rank or prioritize one piece of information or one idea over the other. So in this situation, students have to formulate an opinion or say which is more important than the other and why, using evidence. The final stage, according to Bloom's taxonomy, the final thinking skill, which is the most advanced, according to Bloom's, would be for students to create their own representations of their knowledge. So maybe they develop their own story to reflect character development. Or maybe they write their own research essay on the American Revolution, or they create their own PowerPoint to teach others about the American Revolution, or they imagine a future peaceful revolution that they could create to spur change in current society, and why. Here's another visual representation of Bloom's taxonomy, and you can look at that on your own time. The nice thing about this visual is it also provides questions to relate to each level. So Webb's depth of knowledge is pretty similar to Bloom's taxonomy. Webb's depth of knowledge, however, only has 4 levels. The first level is what we would call basic or lower level thinking skills. And this would be recall and reproduction. So similar to Bloom's, in this stage, students are primarily just reciting or repeating information. They're remembering facts. So an example of this might be defining something, stating a fact, labeling, reciting, Googling and finding out the information. That would be recall and reproduction. It would be a basic thinking skill. It's still good for students to know, but we really want to expand beyond that eventually in our instruction so that students can practice thinking for themselves. So the next three stages are advanced or higher order thinking skills. So the first one would be called skill and concepts. So in this situation, students are applying their knowledge to a new situation. Or they're comparing things, comparing the similarities and differences between two concepts. The third level, which is also an advanced thinking level, is short-term strategic thinking. So in this level, students are analyzing and evaluating whether or not something is important in the short term. So an example of this might be having a debate, or writing a persuasive writing, or judging something, or making a flow chart about how these information connects and the importance of that information. The final stage, according to Webb's, would be extended thinking. So in extended thinking, students solve real-world problems, and they use their skills of analysis, where they compare and contrast and connect to previous knowledge. They use their knowledge of application, where they connect their previous knowledge to new information. And they also use their evaluation ability to determine what's the most important to solve that real world problem. And another thing to remember about extended thinking, the last stage according to Webb's, is that this is something that students cannot do in just one day. It's going to be a continual process that's going to last at least several days, several classes. So an example of this might be a research project, or students writing their own original stories and going through the writing process, or going through the writing workshop, or students creating their own song or multimedia presentation to present their knowledge. Here's another visual representation of Webb's depth of knowledge. Now we're going to move on to part 4, teaching the actual lesson. So the first step of teaching the actual lesson, which is step 5 out of all of our lesson planning and lesson instruction steps, is to connect to students' prior knowledge and experiences. So when you're introducing a new topic, after you've given them the diagnostic test to see their background foundational knowledge, you're going to want to connect the new content topic to what students have learned in previous grade levels, what they've learned in their home lives or in their communities, and in their native cultures. So when you're planning for this stage, think about what kind of guided questions or reflection questions can you pose to students so that they think back on what they've learned before, either at home, in their communities, or in their schools. Think about how can we connect this lesson to what students already know about a particular content subject, to vocabulary words students are already familiar with, to skills students already know to do or apply, and books or texts that they have already read. The benefit of this anticipatory set, or connecting this information to students' prior knowledge, is that it increases students' engagement in the lesson. It also provides an opportunity for the teacher to correct any past misunderstandings or misconceptions that the student might have had from previous years. So the student might have had the misconception that the sun is smaller than the earth because it looks so small, because it's so far away in the sky. Or that the sun is smaller than the moon because it looks smaller sometimes in the sky during parts of the day. this is a misconception. The sun is obviously bigger than the earth and the moon. And so students would have to be corrected on this misunderstanding. The next step when teaching a lesson is to explain the relevance of the lesson. Why is it important to students? Why would it matter to their lives? So in this case, you're going to want to connect the lesson to students' future goals and also their interests. So how would learning this knowledge be beneficial for students in their future careers or in their future lives as adults? And how would this information relate to things they're already interested in? What their favorite sports or foods or activities or games? And I like this visual at the bottom because it's important to show you that you really need to connect and explain relevance, or students will most likely ignore what you have to say, even if it is important. If they don't see why this information relates to their lives, they will probably zone out and not listen to it. However, if you explicitly explain how this information can connect to their daily lives, students will be more likely to remember it and to be engaged in the lesson. Now we're going to go over the lesson delivery cycle. So this is the actual cycle in which you will teach new content information. So during the lesson delivery cycle, you should follow the gradual release cycle. The gradual release cycle was developed based off of Vygotsky's theories of the zone of proximal development. Basically, that students need plenty of scaffolds at the beginning of a new lesson, but gradually the teacher can remove those scaffolds until students can do things independently. And this gradual release cycle was developed by Frey and Fisher based off Vygotsky's theories. So the gradual release model, or gradual release cycle, follows the following components. First is the explicit instruction, or the I do, where the teacher is primarily leading the instruction. The second part is the guided practice, or the we do, where students practice the activity with the teacher and with their peers. And finally is the independent practice, or the you do, where the students practice on their own independently. So step 7 in our lesson planning cycle is to consider what types of explicit or teacher-led instruction you will provide to students. So how will you explain the new information in simple, straightforward language? How will you teach the new content information in chunks without overwhelming students? Remember, you don't want to teach more than 5 new pieces of information at a time, because after that it's hard for people to remember, the average person to remember more knowledge than that. And then when you're teaching and modeling, many times teachers will do a think aloud, where they'll actively talk out loud about what their thinking process was to solve a problem. Or the teacher will model the activity several times and how the teacher herself or himself conducts the activity or solves the activity on their own. During the explicit instruction, when the teacher is going over the content, the teacher also needs to frequently check for understanding to see if students really are listening and understanding what the teacher is saying. Step 8 in the lesson planning cycle is to think about how students will have guided practice opportunities with the new content information. Another way to think of this would be modeling or we do. So in this stage, students are working with the teacher, they're actively participating. Maybe they're copying the problem on the board and working the problem with the teacher, or maybe they're playing the instrument with the teacher, or doing the project or the experiment with the teacher. And while the student is doing it and practicing with the scaffold of teacher support, the teacher is providing instant feedback and support and assistance if students are struggling. Another part of the guided practice model is that students not only work with the scaffold of teacher support, they not only work along with the teacher, but also students have time to work collaboratively in groups so that they have the support of their peers. And for example, one part of this, or one element of this, could be maybe a student's working in a collaborative learning project where they have to practice the content together. Students give each other feedback and support, and the teacher also walks around and observes each student group, providing feedback and support if needed. Once students have seen the teacher model the activity, and they've practiced the activity with the teacher support and with their peer support, students are ready to work on their own. This will provide students with some autonomy and some feeling of self-efficacy, in that they will be able to complete the task on their own without excessive amounts of support from either their peers or their teacher. The teacher is still going to walk around and provide suggestions or feedback to students, and the teacher will provide those suggestions through guided questions, like, how could we do this in a different way? Or why did you do this instead of this? And so the student is still having to do the majority of the thinking, but the teacher is just providing some clues or some hints to guide the student's thinking. So the student is still primarily doing most of the cognitive load. They're thinking primarily for themselves and practicing primarily on their own. Based off teacher feedback, the students also might choose to rework a given situation or problem to solve it independently in a better way. At the end of the lesson, after the student has practiced with the teacher, with their peers, and on their own, students will then engage in reflection and closure. So in the reflection stage, students consider their learning. They think about what were the most important things they learned. How could they connect this learning to their future goals or their future tasks? How could this learning relate to things they've seen before in other classes or in other subject areas? And what other goals or interests do students want to learn about related to the topic? What else could they discover? Another part of the reflection and closure stage is for students to have their own self-assessment. Students consider how effectively did they gain the skill or content area. Also, do they have a strong understanding, or do they still have some enduring questions that they need to address? What ways can they further improve and grow their knowledge in the topic area? Then there's the closure part of this stage. In the closure parts, the teacher will have students summarize main concepts and maybe summarize or connect the current lesson to their previous lessons through either summarizing orally to their partner or writing down a summary on a piece of paper, or maybe presenting to the class something they learned from the topic. The teacher also will take time to discuss the main takeaways of the lesson, provide a reminder to students about how this information connects to earlier lessons they've learned in that class, The teacher will also reiterate the importance and relevance of that lesson. And finally, the teacher will restate the learning objectives that students were asked to obtain in this lesson. What were the content knowledge they needed to learn, and what language skills did they practice? So, what were the content objectives and language objectives of the lesson? Now we move on to part 4, evaluating learning. So, in this stage, which is now our 11th step of the lesson planning and lesson delivery cycle, the teacher will administer the formative assessments they had created. So remember, the formative assessment was a quick assessment to evaluate a specific chunk of information or a section of information. Remember also that students should be successful on the formative assessment before the teacher moves on to a new topic. If you move on too quickly, you might leave some students behind and gaps of learning could occur, because if they never fully acquired that earlier topic and then you introduce a more difficult topic, students are going to be falling further behind. So an example might be if your student is struggling with writing a complete simple sentence and you move on to discuss complex sentences, students are going to have trouble, because not only will they not understand how to write a simple complete sentence with just a subject and verb, but now you're introducing complex sentences with subject, verbs, objects, and clauses, and other parts of speech. That would be further overwhelming for that student. Remember also that it's important to have at least one formative assessment per day. It doesn't have to, once again, go into the grade book, but you should have some formative assessment for after each lesson you teach to students. Another thing to note about formative assessments is, similar to our learning objectives, they need to be grade level appropriate. They need to be at an appropriate rigor, a level of difficulty level that matches or exceeds the level of difficulty level that students will see on district and state summative assessments. The formative assessment needs to be appropriate and authentic. So it needs to be similar to how students had practiced with the content during the original lesson. If you taught students how to add 2-digit numbers, but you did not teach them how to regroup, you just taught them how to just add 2-digit numbers without regrouping, and then you gave them an assessment that had them solve problems with regrouping and some without regrouping, that would not be an authentic or appropriate assessment, because students haven't been prepared yet to be successful in that assessment. Another thing to note is that for formative assessments, they need to be able to be clearly evaluated. So there should be some form of rubric or some clear way that you can determine whether the students mastered the topic or not. They also need to be valid, so they need to accurately assess whether students understood the topic, and they need to be reliable. So the situation in which you present the assessment does not directly change how students score. So you could administer it on a Monday versus a Friday, and students would still score relatively the same. Now we move on to part 5, analyzing outcomes. Step 12 of the lesson planning and lesson delivery cycle is to provide students with feedback. Feedback should be based on how students performed on the formative assessment. Feedback should also be timely, specific, and constructive. Since the teacher, for the most part, can control when the formative assessment is administered, because the teacher created the formative assessment or found the formative assessment, the teacher can also reasonably grade the formative assessment within a few days. The teacher doesn't have to wait for the district to come back with testing results or the state. So when you administer a formative assessment at the end of each lesson, you want to provide those results as soon as possible, at least or the latest within a couple days. This way, it's still fresh on students' minds. They'll remember what was the assessment, and also they're more likely to remember what was their thinking process, so they can reflect on whether their thinking process was accurate or not. Also, it makes the formative assessments more relevant to students. If students know they're going to go over it the next day, they know that they need to try hard on the assessment rather than just put it off because, oh, maybe the teacher may or may not talk about it in a month later, but it's not going to be a big deal either way. So if students know that you're going to talk about it the next day, they'll probably try harder on the assessment. In addition, feedback needs to be specific. It needs to tell students what exactly they did right, and also what areas do they need to improve. Not only what do they need to improve or what they got wrong, but how they can improve, what ways they can learn the skill or concept or practice the skill and concept in a different way to be successful the next time. What I would normally do after each formative assessment is that I would have my students correct anything they missed. This way, when students did their corrections, they learned from their mistakes, and I would also provide them suggestions, both either written feedback or also oral feedback on how they could correct their work. And this actually also led them to improve their grade, which made students feel increased satisfaction on their performance. Another important thing to remember about feedback is it needs to be constructive. So overall, it needs to be positive. It needs to focus on students' performance on the task itself, not students' natural abilities, not whether students are smart or hardworking or on task. That is not really your goal in your feedback. You're just trying to provide students with specific feedback on their performance. Another thing is you want to emphasize how students have grown from their previous performance to their current performance. So emphasize their growth and improvement. Also, if students put in a significant amount of effort, discuss that as well. If students put in a lot of effort into completing the activity, you can praise that effort. But likewise, if you feel like students kind of either procrastinated or put the minimum amount of effort, you might explain to them that you think they are certainly capable of doing better on the next formative assessment, but this is more of a reflection of their effort and why you think it's a reflection of their effort and how you know that they, with effort, could drastically improve. Once again, constructive feedback focuses on continuous improvement. It also provides targeted strategies to suggest how students can improve. So it's not just the end grade, but rather how can students take this information, this feedback, and continue to grow and develop, and how the teacher can express to students that their whole purpose is to ensure student success. They're in it not because they want the students' grades to make the teacher look good. The teacher is in it because they want the students to be successful in life. And they know that this is an important activity and that also learning how to continuously improve can help them whatever career or path they take in the future. So emphasizing that the teacher's main incentive is to help the student grow intellectually and with their professional skills. Step 13 of the planning and teaching cycle involves providing opportunities to self-reflect on their own performance. Not only should teachers provide feedback to students, but students should provide feedback to themselves. And the teacher should help facilitate and model to students how they can provide their own self-reflection and feedback to themselves. So students can do this by considering both what they did positively, what were their strengths, but also what areas could they improve, their growth areas. Furthermore, part of the self-reflection process should discuss overall progress. How are students improving over time? How are they growing? And how is this growth related to the speed of growth that the district or state is expecting that students learn at that grade level? Then the teacher should help the student develop their own improvement goals and also a criteria for determining whether or not students have met their goals. So maybe a student might make the goal, I am going to improve my understanding of nonfiction texts. And then the student's criteria for that will be, I will read 3 nonfiction texts and write a main idea for each one and show that to my teacher. Or the student's goal might be, I will reach grade level reading fluency by the end of the next 6 weeks. And then the measurement might be the student's 6 weeks reading assessment, or students reading to the teacher and the teacher records how many words per minute that students decoded accurately. Apart from having students self-reflect, teachers need to have students write down their goals and their criteria and then revisit those goals and criteria. So the teacher should set aside regular time for students to reflect on their progress, and also the teacher should set aside individual time to work with each student to discuss each student's individual progress and whether or not students should modify their goals or expand their goals because they've met them. So during this time period, teachers can share in student success and celebrate that success while also providing students with feedback and encouragement to continue their progress for their next learning goal that the student creates. Now we're on part 6, providing follow-up. So step 14 of the lesson planning and lesson delivery cycle is to provide differentiation. There's 3 different types of differentiation: remediation, language support, and enrichment or extension. The first type is called remediation. During remediation, students who are not fully understanding a concept or who did not do very well in the formative assessment get additional support from the teacher. Remediation means that the teacher is going to instruct students in a different way because the first way was not successful. They're going to teach the content with new lesson materials, with new instructional strategies or techniques, and students are going to practice with the content in different ways. Remediation might also mean that students have to go back and review foundational knowledge from earlier grade levels. So sometimes remediation can mean that student has to be reading texts that are below grade level but are at students' reading level. Or some parts of remediation might be students have to go back and review foundational learning to be able to be successful on the current topic. The second part of differentiation could be providing language support. So this could be for your English language learners that overall are understanding the content, but they just still need to develop their academic language skills. So this could be reviewing academic vocabulary. It could be going over grammar or editing their writing or speaking or their projects that they created to demonstrate their knowledge. It could be expanding on their reading fluency or their reading comprehension skills by reading a text about the given content. The third part of differentiation could be enrichment or extension. So for students who've done well on their assessment, they're ready to be enriched. They're ready to have their thinking extended. So when you are working with your students who are already advanced or on grade level, you want to make sure that you provide additional practice opportunities in ways that are higher rigor or higher difficulty level. So go back to your blooms and think about how can I extend my students' thinking so they're using more critical thinking skills. So how can I have my students apply their knowledge in a different way, or analyze the concepts in a different way, or evaluate what is the most important and why, or create their own representations of their knowledge? There's a couple more things to know. Going back to remediation, when you're reteaching a concept, it's very important that you try to use hands-on learning activities. So try to have like real-world texts, or have students use manipulatives, or use kinesthetic learning where they're physically moving objects and practicing with the teacher. Another thing is you want to make sure you have high engagement texts that students really are connecting with. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but make sure that when you're providing remediation, you meet students at their current ability level, not necessarily their current grade level. Some students might be below grade level, and you'll have to meet them initially at that grade level, and then eventually increase and support them and increase the difficulty level until finally they reach grade level. Also, another thing to remember about remediation is since these students struggled on the assessment, you need to provide students with small group support because they need more individualized learning. The first way you taught the lesson to the whole class was not successful. So you have to teach it in a different way, and you also have to structure the learning environment in a different way to make it more individualized. So make it either small group or individual instruction. This will ensure that students pay more attention and have more individual support. Another thing that I didn't put here on the slide, but something to remember, is after you provide remediation, provide a second formative assessment to see whether that remediation was successful. Hopefully students do better on the second assessment, and then you can determine, okay, students are understanding the concept, I'm ready to eventually move on to the new topic that's a slightly more advanced. However, if students are still struggling on the second assessment, then you might need to reteach again and continue remediation. Your first remediation wasn't successful. So when providing language supports, some other things to remember when you're supporting and teaching language to your English language learners is that some ways that you can provide contextual support would be through images, or providing real objects, or hands-on learning experiences with manipulatives. You should also, once again, meet students at their current linguistic level. So if students are reading below grade level, or require simplified texts or less difficult vocabulary, provide them that. Eventually, you're going to increase the difficulty level where students get to be on grade level, but meet them at their current level. Also, another thing about language supports is that if you can, provide students with native language support. Research shows that the more native language proficiency students have, the more likely they're going to be successful in learning English, and the faster they'll learn English. So the more of their native language they know, the better they will become at English. So don't be afraid to incorporate things from their native language. If you do not know their native language, you can find materials. You can find instructional videos in their native language. You can find books or texts or worksheets in their native language. You can also try to learn part of their native language and see if there are any cognates between English and their native language. So cognates are words that look and sound the same and have the same meaning across two languages. So one example of cognate might be computer or computadora. They have a pretty similar sound and they have the same meaning. Or teléfono and telephone. So you can try to find cognates across English and that student's native language to help them connect their learning to their native language. And if you build students' content knowledge in their native language, they can transfer those skills to understanding the content in English. Some other things to remember about enrichment or extension is that this is for students who've done very well on the assessment. They're ready to be challenged and to be exposed to higher order thinking skills and to more rigorous learning experiences with the content area. You can even go above grade level if desired. Another thing to note is that enrichment students often can work on their own or in small groups in self-directed learning activities. So many times, because they're advanced students and they're already understanding the concepts, they probably can do a lot of their learning on their own or through peer teaching. This way, if you give them projects that they can do on their own and self-directed learning, they will be off on their own working and completing and still doing meaningful activities related to the content and expanding their knowledge, but you will have more time to devote to your remediation groups that need additional content support, and also your language groups or your English language learners that need more academic language support. So providing your advanced students with enrichment and extension activities that they can do on their own is very beneficial so that you can work in small groups with your remediation group and then later with your English language learner group. This is not the only model for designing instruction. There's also another alternative lesson planning model that many people use sometimes in the sciences. And this is called the 5E model. We're not going to go too much into depth, but I just wanted to introduce it to you. The 5E model says first you provide engagement. So you provide like an interesting topic or scenario for students. So you give them what if or imagine this situation or how can we solve this problem. And then the next stage is exploration. Students have hands-on learning activities and they have to experiment with finding a solution. They explore the content on their own. Third, students explain or create their own solution to the problem and their own answers. And then students ask each other more questions and have to explain their thinking. The fourth stage is elaboration, where the teacher proposes that students use what they've learned to apply it to a new situation. So maybe they created how to make a rubber band powered car that uses the energy from the rubber band, the kinetic energy, to power the car. Now students are going to have to use another form of kinetic energy to power another device. So applying the skill in another concept. And then finally, the last stage of the 5E model is evaluation, where students not only demonstrate their learning and their understanding, but they also think about how they could apply these concepts in other situations or think about how they could solve future problems in the world while also receiving evaluation and feedback from teachers. All right, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.